Good morning, afternoon or evening, and welcome to Faction Overview number 3. Now, if you caught my recent guide to defending rushes, then firstly, well done for being a regular watcher, but secondly, for also being aware of this faction's particular strength for this area. Now, the faction in question is the Iberians, and there's a lot more to learn about them, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing for the next few minutes. So let's take it away. The first thing to note about the Iberians is that their buildings are generally stronger than other civilizations, but this does mean that they also cost more resources and take longer to build. Now, a good example of how this works in practice is with their towers. These take almost double the time of the Celtic factions and almost a third longer than any other civilization to build, and their stone cost is 2.5 times all other civilizations. However, on the flip side, they can garrison 8 soldiers rather than the usual 5. Now, whether you consider this longer build time and greater resource cost to be worth the strength payoff depends on your playstyle, and that brings us to point 2. And point 2 is that if you favour a strong defence, then Iberians could be the faction for you. Let's look at a couple of other examples on top of the towers that we've already covered. Now, firstly, they start with city walls, and this is probably the clearest difference with any other faction. However, these are essential to them, as their starting melee infantry are swordsmen rather than spearmen, meaning they'd otherwise be vulnerable to early cavalry rushes. Secondly, their fortress is also stronger than other civilizations' versions. It's almost double the hit points of the Celtic factions and around 50% stronger than most civilizations. And for this, you only have to spend an additional 200 stone. Now, this does mean that if one of them gets built, it can be very difficult for your opponent to knock it down. Another great feature of their defensive nature is one of their unique structures, the revered monument. This gives plus 20% attack damage within 50 metres. However, as it's stationary, it tends to offer a defensive bonus rather than an attacking one. It's worth also bearing in mind that you can build more than one of these. Now, as you should be able to see from what I've just said, city walls fortified with highly garrisoned towers, strong fortresses and a couple of revered monuments can make it very difficult to take down the Iberians when they're dug in. So basically, your civic centre is going to be safe until at least phase 3. The final thing I'd like to mention about the Iberians is their heroes. They're just a truly superb range, and in fact I'd say they're probably the best available to any faction. However, we're going to be looking at these in more depth shortly, so after whetting your appetite I'm just going to make you wait. So sorry about that. But in summation, due to the nature of their army and the bonuses, they're definitely more suited to defensively minded players. However, they can be a lot of fun, and they've got a reasonable array of troops, which means that they suit a generally more basic approach. This can suit newer players, and it works really well on the Corinthian Isthmus map, for instance. Anyway, let's have a look at those troops in a little more depth. As we've established, your starting melee infantry are swordsmen, meaning that cavalry rushes are more difficult to repel, but this is remedied by phase 2 when spears become available, alongside slingers. The main issue with the troop makeup is that no sword cavalry are available at all, and neither are elephants, and that means you're left with only rams to counter enemy siege. And unless you can get these guys out quickly to the opponent, it can be difficult to stop a siege onslaught from a more technologically advanced army. As for their navy, well, it's almost better not to ask. Although they do have one interesting unique feature, fire ships. Now these ships are literally on fire, and they sink other ships through setting them alight. They only have a short lifespan, so you can't build them to use in future, but they can be a great and cheap way to take out opposition navies. And if that opposition navy ships are loaded with troops, it can actually be devastating. Also, they actually needn't only be used on ships. They can attack anything that touches the sea, so docks and people stood by the shore are also at risk. So, all in all, they can be a fun aside, but they're not really something you can build an army or a strategy around. Now, before we get to the section you're all waiting for, let's have a very quick look at the champions. They're all available for the fortress, although, as with a number of factions, you could spend 1,000 metal to get these guys from the barracks, should you choose. Now, the champions themselves are swordsmen and skirmisher cavalry. Now, that may sound pretty standard, but you'd be wrong. Well, not in the case of the swordsmen. These are absolutely what you'd expect and nothing special. However, the skirmisher cavalry is actually pretty awful against units. As you can see on the screen, it only has 5 pierce damage as opposed to 18 for a normal skirmisher cavalry. That seems a bit odd, but the reason is because they're actually for use against buildings. Now, they have flaming javelins that give them crush damage. This means they can take out enemy structures, and in an emergency can even be used against rams. However, like the fire ships, they're a bit of a novelty and not something that I can imagine people using a lot. That said, it's not impossible to imagine that having a very mobile anti-building unit towards the end could prove particularly useful, especially if you're trying to capture a barracks or another enemy building in the late game. And so to the section you've all been waiting for, heroes. Now for these I have one word: amazing. It's actually quite weird to think that one of the biggest issues with Iberians is simply choosing which of the awesome heroes you'd most like. So, having taught them up a little bit, let's have a quick look. So first up is Indabil. He's a cavalry spearman, and he makes your soldiers arrive 20% more quickly and reduces their recourse cost by 15%. Now this knocks 8 wood and 8 food off the cost of a skirmisher, which I think you'll agree is a pretty decent return. He's also my personal favourite, as cavalry heroes are just always good to have around, and the opportunity to reinforce cheaply and quickly in the late game is an absolute game changer. Now my second favourite is Karos. He gives 75% more arrows for each soldier garrisoned in any siege engine or building. However, this is nerfed slightly by Iberians not actually having any siege engines for which this would be relevant. However, if you have a teammate with siege towers, this can be a massive bonus. His second bonus is +1 armour to all soldiers within 50 metres. I think you'll agree this is an absolutely superb bonus that means he comes a very close second to Indabil in my choice. And the final hero, and I have to admit I've never actually used him due to the other hero's brilliance, would still be worth getting for most factions. He's Viriato, and he's another sword infantryman. He doubles the loot for every building or unit destroyed, and also gives a 20% speed bonus. Nothing to be sniffed at. And like I said, he's still a decent hero, but for me, compared to the first two, I'm afraid he comes a distant third. Now before we finish up and go to an overview of some strategies and things, we're just going to have a quick look at the unique upgrades that are available. There's only one that's really worth going through, and it's pretty much the same one that we covered in the Morians video. It's called Toledo Steel for Iberians, and it's available at Phase 3 from the Blacksmith, and it gives +20% hack for all swordsmen, including champions. Now the only other point of note that you might want to think about is when you're playing team games. Anyone with Iberians as a teammate will find their skirmishers reducing costs by 20%. Now this is great for your teammates, as you can imagine, if not for yourself, so make sure they'll throw some resources your way in exchange for this wonderful gift you're offering them. And that brings our Iberians overview to a close. So what tips can we provide in terms of strategies you might want to use? Now 1. Walls. They're just not the panacea that you think they may be. They can easily become like a prison with you trapped inside, so be prepared to head outside as soon as possible to collect resources. To help with this, you can use the turrets of the walls in the same way as towers, garrisoning soldiers in them to help defend your otherwise vulnerable woodcutters. 2. You need access to stone. Now because of their strength, your buildings cost more of this resource, so plan to get as much of it as possible. Which leads me on to 3. Upgrades. Now in terms of upgrades, there are 2 essential ones you need to talk about. Toledo Steel, so that your swordsmen have a chance against rams and the other siege weapons that you're otherwise vulnerable to. And you also should get all of the stone collecting upgrades. You'll need a lot of this material, as we've already established, so it's well worth the 1450 food and negligible stone and metal investment to get all 3 upgrades. 4 is your heroes. Now you're going to have a choice of 2 basically. Now on a map where there are lots of resources and or you have a low population cap, then the armour bonus offered by Karos is probably best. However, if resources are scarce, particularly metal, which is essential for the swordsmen that are going to be required to make up most of your army, and or you have a high population cap, then Indabil's resource and time bonus in terms of training troops is a surefire winner. And finally 5, your development. Now due to the extra build time and additional resources that are required for Iberians, be prepared to accept that you're going to develop more slowly than most other factions. Therefore, expanding slowly but carefully and using all 5 of the allowed revered monuments alongside your extra strength towers and fortresses to help fortify your position is your best chance of success with this faction. And with that we've come to the end, so thanks for watching. Please let me know if you have any particular civilizations you'd like to see covered in future, and if you enjoyed it, hit like, hit subscribe, and other than that, I'll see you next week.